Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. On his maiden visit to India, US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson discussed a host of issues with Prime Minister Narendra Modi and External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj, including the H-1B visa, terrorism in Pakistan and bilateral engagement between New Delhi and Washington. Tillerson also held a meeting with National Security Advisor Ajit Doval on Wednesday. India and the United States agreed to further accelerate and strengthen their bilateral engagement when Tillerson called on Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Wednesday. Welcoming Tillerson, the Prime Minister noted with appreciation the firm upward trajectory in the bilateral strategic partnership following positive and far-reaching talks with US President Donald Trump in Washington in June this year. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the takeaways from Rex Tillerson's visit to India. Joining me on the program today are Sanjay Kapoor, editor of The Hard News; Bharat Karnad, Research Professor, National Security Studies, Center for Policy Research; Chintamani Mahapatra, Pro-Vice Chancellor, JNU; and Neeraj Srivastava, former diplomat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of A Big Picture. Sanjay Kapoor, I'd like to start with you, of course. Does this visit of the Secretary of State strengthen the bilateral relationship between India and the United States?
Surely, I mean, the relationship between India and US are on an upward trajectory, and there is no denying that the relationship between both the countries is going from strength to strength. And this is a follow-up on President Trump's Afghan policy that he announced a couple of months ago, and Tillerson is supposed to take forward some of the things that he had discussed. So from that standpoint, I think it is a fairly significant visit. It also, in a certain way, gives meaning to what Mr. Tillerson spoke some time back about US vision about China, close ties with India. And India seems to be the center of much of what they want to do in Asia. So I think it's a very, very important trip, visit to, and the outcomes will surely make in a certain way, deepen ties between the two countries.
Sure. Ambassador, let me bring you into the picture now. Let's not forget that Rex Tillerson first went to Pakistan before visiting India, and then a surprise visit to Afghanistan before he actually went to Pakistan. Afghanistan wasn't even on his itinerary, and he decided to go to Afghanistan as well. Clearly, Afghanistan is somewhere worrying the American establishment, and they want to get Afghanistan under control.
Yeah, but the reason his visit was not announced, he actually also went to Iraq.
Iraq, yes.
Was because of security reasons. There was no other reason. As far as this visit to India is concerned, I think to understand this visit, you have to go back about 8 days and see the speech which Tillerson delivered at the Washington think tank on 18th of October. There were 3 major issues in that. The first was the security of the Asia-Pacific region, and he said that India and the United States are at the 2 bookends of that region. Second was this China's Belt and Road Initiative. This was the second one. And when he came to India, the third issue which was added was terrorism. So Afghanistan, many issues figured in this visit. Afghanistan was one of them.
Yes.
But to my mind, the most important issue in this particular visit was China, because of the role China has been playing, in the South China Sea, what they did in Doklam, they are expanding, their expansionist power. So Tillerson and Indian Foreign Minister, they held a joint press conference after this visit, and there Tillerson said that United States would like to help India to build the capacity for maintaining security in this Asia-Pacific region.
Sure.
And there was a clear, indication towards China. The other important outcome, concrete, is that it was announced that a bilateral forum between the United States and India has been constituted to designate terrorist groups. It will hold its first meeting in December. And why it is important is that they, I'm sure, will name Masood Azhar, whom China has been protecting in the UN Security Council so far. So this is going to make things very uncomfortable for China.
Right.
Basically. Because again, Pakistan is important, but why has Pakistan become important? because of transfer of nuclear and weapons and missile technology by China. The bigger problem for this whole region is not Pakistan. Pakistan is a small problem. The bigger problem, not only for this whole region, but for global security, I think today is China.
Okay.
And that was I think you may not read a lot of things, in the press about it, but as far as I can see it, the real issue which was discussed was China.
Okay, the real issue that was discussed was China, and the message was loud and clear for China is what you're suggesting at the moment. But since you brought Pakistan up, I want to raise Pakistan with Professor Bharat Karnad right now. When Rex Tillerson visited Pakistan, this is what he said. I mean, I have that here written down somewhere. Tillerson told Abbasi that Pakistan is very important regionally to our joint goals of providing peace and security to the region and providing opportunity for greater economic relationship. So clearly there was a message for Pakistan as well, contrary to what the Indian media has reported here in India, saying that there was a strong message out to Pakistan as far as terror havens are concerned.
Look, the point of fact is that Pakistan is central to US strategy, not just in terms of Afghanistan, but also in terms of China. America wouldn't like the Chinese to consolidate their strength and presence in Pakistan. That's simple. And it's been made clear to Islamabad by Tillerson, earlier by Matters, that as long as the Afghan problem festers, the US will be in this part of the world and will ensure that the Taliban don't succeed. That's the basic template for US policy vis-a-vis this part of Southern Asia. But the larger question that Tillerson, I think in a sense, expounded in the CSIS talk that the ambassador referred to, he talked about a 100-year partnership. Now, the problem is you can hardly look beyond 1 month at the way the developments are going. To talk about 100 years seems a bit optimistic. The point, I think, is this. Much of what the US has in terms of the differences that India has with the United States have not been resolved. Not during Obama's time, and it hasn't so far in the 9 months that Trump has been in Washington. And of course, everything depends on the next Twitter message that Trump might send out, which pretty much undercuts everything that anybody does. But that said, the point is this. Look at the issue of totalization. That's been there for years together. Nothing has been done. H-1B visas that the Indian government has been, badgering the US interlocutors for years together. Do something. Just as you think that, and one would have hoped that they are paying attention to Sushma Swaraj and everybody else talking and pleading about H-1B visas. Yesterday, the US government made it clear that H-1B regularization is going to become more difficult for Indian engineers. Now, so what's one to make of it? What one has to conclude is that the US will do what's in its interest. That leaves it to Delhi to decide very clearly what our interests are vis-a-vis the US, not be taken in by rhetoric, 100-year partnership and this, that and the other. It's a load of, well, cock and bull.
Okay.
But the point, I think, is that you have to be very clear about your interests. Now, the question in my mind is, and it always arises, and this has been the major problem with the Indian government, as I see it, and I have seen it for the last 30-odd years, we are not at all clear about our interests.
Okay.
Everybody else seems to be very clear, but we do not seem to be very clear as to what it is that we want, what we think is in our interest, and what we would like outside extraterritorial powers, what their role should be.
Okay, fair enough. Let me bring in Professor Mahapatra now. Like Professor Karnad has just pointed out, do you believe that, terror is the common enemy between India and the United States, but our priorities in the region are different because the Americans are only concerned about what's happening in Afghanistan and we are concerned on what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir?
This problem will continue. Pakistan is important to the United States, mainly because Pakistan still influences, controls and helps Taliban. Taliban today controls about 40% of the territory in Afghanistan. 16, 17 years of bombing by NATO and the US, and Taliban is still alive and kicking. So while talking many things about terrorism, against terrorism will continue to be in Afghanistan until peace prevails and all that statements are being made, the fundamental message that has gone to Taliban is those who want to talk, please come and talk, or else we will continue our bombardment and our military action. In fact, just about a few days ago, the decision has been taken that CIA is going to get more and more involved in Afghanistan. It is already getting involved. In the process, we do not know how many American troops are there, how many special forces are there. Only the numbers are being counted. 9,000 right now, 4,000 more, only 13,000. I think the US, the Trump administration is trying to bring an end to the Afghanistan situation, particularly looking for a right kind of opportunity where they get out.
What kind of role do they foresee for India?
For India, I think they are putting pressure on Taliban from different ways, both Taliban and Pakistan. Put too much pressure on them, even continue your combat, at the same time have alternative sources of your different kinds of mechanism. I think getting India into Afghanistan and asking that India should play an important role is basically messaging to Pakistan that if you don't come on board, if you don't talk to the Taliban, don't ask them to come and negotiate, then we are going to continue to encourage the Indians to spread their soft power in Afghanistan. In a way, it's an indirect pressure on Pakistan. So I think it is very clear that when he comes to India, it was not an India-specific visit, but the countries he visited, except Switzerland, are all connected with Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, then Pakistan, then he comes to India. And second point, and very important point is this. Donald Trump is going to visit East Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, etc. Just before he would go there, Tillerson is coming here, and they have a big picture about Indo-US relationship, that India and the US must play a positive role in maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. At the diplomatic level, I think this is also important that when he came here, he must have discussed with our leaders about how to co-opt India into the larger Indo-Pacific strategy. That is where the China will figure, and not in the South Asia one. In the South Asia context, Pakistan, Afghanistan. In the Indo-Pacific context, China, Japan, etc. After all, when the standoff at Doklam was going on, India, Japan, and the US did hold that exercise,
Malabar exercise
at Malabar. So I think it is many things on the plate, not just one issue.
Okay, a lot of the issues discussed, not just one particular issue. It was a gamut of issues is what you're suggesting. Coming back to the Afghanistan point, Sanjay Kapoor, do you believe that as far as Trump's South Asia policy is concerned, the Americans are looking at some kind of an assurance, a concrete assurance from India as far as Afghanistan is concerned, and we've not been able to give them that?
Before I come to your question, what I want to really say is in Afghanistan and Pakistan, US has begun to lose influence. There has been a rise of influence of China, and especially after the big investment they have made in CPEC, about $100 billion. And increasingly, Pakistan is negotiating, talking, engaging with China and Russia. If you remember, when Mr. Donald Trump gave his Afghan policy speech, the first phone call the Pakistani Prime Minister made was to President Putin, and he wanted to know whether what really means for him. And Russia and subsequently China both came to the defense of Pakistan. So it's a reality which is fast changing, and increasingly the Russians see US trying to play a different kind of role. They have been accusing US for airlifting unemployed Islamic State warriors from Syria and Iraq to Afghanistan, and they think they are the ones who are stirring problems there. Russia has been negotiating with Taliban. In fact, the US has been accusing Russia for arming Taliban, because the Russians think that Taliban is an indigenous force and they can take on the Islamic State, which is a non-state and ultra, it goes beyond their loyalty to a country. So in a certain way, things are very, very fluid, and US is trying to reclaim some of the initiative that it has lost. It wants to work with India, and in fact, if you remember that speech, that kind of formulations haven't been made with Donald Trump asking India that you have made a lot of money and it's time to spend in Afghanistan. So there are people who read it differently. They thought that India was asking US to put boots on the ground, which India has been maintaining time and again that they would not do something like this. And in fact, some of the voices from our experience or from our external ministry have said in so many words. So US wants a greater role. They would want us to put maybe, if not troops, then maybe more money in that area. But it is no longer what it used to be earlier, where US could call the shots. I mean, you have China and Russia and Pakistan playing a bigger role. Saudi Arabia is also on a bit of a retreat. They want to modernize. They want to become more moderate. They don't want to spend money in that region as much as they did earlier. You remember when the crisis in Yemen took place, Saudi Arabia was very keen that Pakistan should also send troops. But I think China weighed heavily on Pakistan, and Pakistan for the first time said no, they won't be able to send troops there. So I would not, put so much of, you can say, importance in the ability of Mr. Tillerson and the US to decide exactly on what is going to happen, because I think US has lost its credibility. Since 2001, they've had forces in Afghanistan. It's been 16 years, and they have not been able to subdue Taliban. So what are they doing? I mean, I remember visiting Pakistan, and their military leadership would say that we've been able to stabilize our part, especially FATA and others. But what about Afghanistan, where US with all the military power haven't been able to do very much?
Sure.
So there are I think competing issues, but US, despite all the bluster, would not be able to do very much.
Okay. Fair enough. Ambassador, the United States, Donald Trump, everyone else, in fact, right from the president to several of his subordinates, to have been calling for robust ties with India. But do you believe that India should keep some kind of a distance from the United States so that we don't alienate maybe a Russia or some of the other world powers?
Yes, I think that is important. And I think India is clear in its mind that it is not going to act like an agent or a proxy of the United States. Let me say that when two countries as big as India and the US talk to each other, there will be areas of convergence and there will be areas of differences. And we cannot expect satisfaction on all issues, and they should not expect satisfaction on all issues. For example, we did not go along with what they wanted to say on North Korea and Iran during this visit, because we have our own views and interests. So just as they did not go along with H-1B visa or totalization, we did go along with this. So there will be differences. But at this point today, if you ask any Indian, what are the biggest security threats for India? They are China and Pakistan, very clearly. Okay, China is a bigger threat because Pakistan is a proxy of China. So China is a bigger threat. We have just seen an example of it, Doklam 72. They are abusing us every day. So this visit is important because Tillerson very specifically named China as a threat in the Indo-Pacific region, and also specifically said that India and US can cooperate to maintain the rule of law, freedom of navigation, the overflights, all the internationally accepted norms in this particular region.
Okay.
That is what India wants. For Pakistan, again, how this is different is very specifically United States has named Pakistan and said that these groups are on its territory. So on these two issues, I think compared to the past, where names were not named and there was wishy-washy language used, this time, as far as our two biggest security threats are concerned, I think we have it is a very satisfactory visit.
Okay, it's a satisfactory visit. You said that Pakistani terror groups have been named, but Bharat Karnat, is that going to change anything on the ground in Pakistan? Is Pakistan even concerned or bothered about anything that's happening here in India, or Rex Tillerson calling out Pakistani terrorists?
Of course, there's concern. I mean, they are worried that there's a new, shall we say, front of India, the US, and so on forming up with Japan, etc., and that they might, in that sense, get the short end of the stick. The problem, though, is this. We haven't progressed very much in defining our own security architecture. And we seem to be quite happy to be part of someone else's architecture. For a country as big as India and so strategically significant, this seems to be a wrong way to go, meaning waiting on the US, waiting on Washington or some other power to tell us what they think is in India's interests. Because if you yourself are not, to go back to what I said earlier, if you yourself are not aware of your own interests and are doing nothing very much in terms of trying to beef it up and prop it up and do the various things that you need to do to build up a coalition of concert of nations as a counterweight to China. And by the way, China is the main threat. Pakistan has never been a military threat, can never be a military threat, will never be a military threat, and never was. It's a minor little power on our flanks, more a nuisance than a threat. And it's a difference that we don't seem to understand, not our foreign office, not our government, right? The difference between nuisance and threat is between a gnat that's pesky, that goes around and can bite you, but also the solution is not to take an elephant gun to it, when you'll blow up your own leg, but to roll up a newspaper and swat it. So you don't seem to again understand the ends and means very well. What are the ends and what are the appropriate means to realize those ends? So that's been our problem for a very long time. So when we talk of Pakistan, we have to let's at least have some sense of proportion and perspective. Pakistan is a minor threat. Deal with it as you deal with any kind of a tactical situation brought up in terms of some terrorist action here and there. Use your surgical strikes, use your special forces, but don't make a big hoo-ha about it, because all you end up doing is losing credibility in the eyes of the world.
Sure. Professor Mahapatra, China has been brought up time and again over the last 20 minutes in our discussion, and we've also seen the sudden extraordinary rise of Xi Jinping over the last few days. Do you see India and the United States coming together, collaborating, cooperating further and trying to corner China?
Some kind of collaboration will continue. India and the US will never come together to contain China. Both India and the US will continue to engage China. There are more than 55,000 Americans living in Hong Kong with residential address and doing business with China. Billions of dollars of American investment are there in China. Billions of dollars of Chinese investment in the USA. They are great trade partners. The kind of Cold War we saw between the US and the USSR in the past is never going to happen between US and China. However, some kind of cold confrontation, some kind of competition, rivalry is going on. And China, after all, is a superpower in the making along India's border. So our ties with the United States is actually important. We should try to bolster our capability as much as possible. And if we want to do that, I think we should not rely just on the USA. There is Russia, there is Germany, there is Britain, so many countries are there. But saying that we should not have any kind of relationship with the USA or maintain sufficient distance from them will not work. Every country in the world, including China and Vietnam and Russians, are engaging the United States. We have to do it. How close we go, it all depends. It is a superpower, it's a mighty power. It is just like the sun. If you go too close, you burn yourself. If you remain distant, you are dark. So we have to decide by analyzing, examining our own interest. As Professor Karnad said, we don't know what exactly our interest, what we are doing. If we can do analysis, some kind of intellectual gymnastic at home and find out, then we can maintain proper distance with the US along with other major powers. So that is the better way of doing it.
Sure.
But let me just hint at one issue on Afghanistan. I may be wrong. This may be dubbed as a conspiracy theory. But when the Americans got stuck in Indochina, partly the Chinese and the Soviets were responsible for that. They were financing, equipping, helping all those Viet Cong fellows. Then comes Soviet Union's Afghanistan for about 10 years, where the Americans were on the other side of the table. Right now, I have a lurking suspicion that the Chinese and the Russians, together with Pakistan, either they are planning or they are dreaming that the Americans should get stuck in Afghanistan.
Okay. So that's the larger game, is what you're
That
suggesting.
is where India is important for the United States.
Fair enough. I've got about 2 minutes left on the program, so quick closing comments from all my guests, starting with Sanjay Kapoor. How do we take the relationship, the India-US relationship, to the next level?
I think what is required, our panelists have said that we have to be very clear about what our national interest is, what do you really want from this relationship, rather than the US deciding a 100-year partnership or some crazy ideas that they have that they want to do with India. I have interacted with a lot of US diplomats, and many of them come out with harebrained suggestions, but I think we need to be very clear about what we want and then move forward, and that is the best thing that we will be able to do to our people.
Okay, Ambassador, there's talk that India and the United States should take their relationship to a strategic partnership. Do we see that happening anytime soon?
Yes, I have mentioned two very concrete results. One is the constitution of that India-US Forum on Terrorism, which will designate international terrorist groups. This is an unprecedented development. And then the United States openly naming China as a threat to the security of the Indo-Pacific. China is our biggest threat. So, and Tillerson said that we are willing to help you to build capacity to maintain security in the region. So, I would say that from a political standpoint and from a security standpoint, this visit has been a very significant visit. What happens in the future, whether the two countries are able to build on it, remains to be seen.
Okay.
But there are concrete takeaways from this visit, which were not present in the past.
Okay.
Yes.
What are the biggest challenges for the ties ahead between India and the United States, Bharat Karnal?
Well, the capacity building aspect. The US has promised that they are going to strategically try and beef up Indian capabilities. But what they do in actual terms is very meager. As I've said on this forum earlier,
yes,
all they keep offering us are 1970s vintage aircraft. Now, what good these damn things will do in the future war is for anybody to guess, except it's a marvelous means of emptying Indian treasury and enriching the United States defense industries. But then we are in the habit of enriching a whole bunch of defense industries all over the world with our importation program, which is what I opposed for 30 years now, and which the government still doesn't seem to take seriously, despite its evocation of Make in India and so on. So here again, we are getting caught in a trap,
right,
because we talk in terms of policy as slogans rather than any substantive content of policy.
Okay, sure. Professor Mahapatra, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Okay, the kind of relationship we had with the USA during the Cold War time is a thing of the past. The kind of strategic partnership we have been building for a couple of decades now is actually the good story. India and the US are doing much better today than ever before, whether in the field of trade and investment, or social and cultural relationship, or educational cooperation, or even defense and security. The kind of defense and security ties we have with the US was never before. During such a long time of strategic partnership with the former Soviet Union, we hardly had any kind of exercises.
Right.
Today you name an area where we don't have exercises with the Americans, joint exercises, military exercises, and even lots of debate, discussion, cooperation, joint development of doctrine, all are going on. I think the relationship is going to move in the positive direction. A little bit ups and downs, like the bump came when Devjani Khobargade issue suddenly came up.
Yes.
Right. So those kinds of things are expected, but otherwise,
minor bumps here and there, but otherwise a robust relationship, going forward. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Bharat Karnal, Chintamani Mahapatra, Neeraj Srivastava and Sanjay Kapoor. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.